Hi, everybody, and welcome back to part two of the ninth module, ninth chapter in critical analysis of the mass media, the online version. I'm Paul Trout, and we're talking about journalism today. In the first part of this video, we talked about news functions and discussed a little bit about what constitutes news. And I just wanted to follow up with this shorter version of video and talk a little bit about what history tells us and what facts fly in the face of modern day arguments that so much of what goes on in news is journalistically biased. The answer to that question is you're probably right when you think that, but it's predicated on the idea that so much of journalism in our history has not been biased. And if we look at this history in this part of the chapter, you'll see that that isn't necessarily so. When you think about the colonial press in America, if you know anything about American history, if you've read a little bit about the American Revolution, the development of the Constitution, you know that freedom of the press was a key and important part of the formation of this country and its laws and policies. And newspapers in this country played a very, very important role during colonial times, leading up to the Revolution. Newspaper owners, publishers, reporters were often the same person. They were people of means. They were often men, and they started newspapers because they could, and they started newspapers because they had political views that they wanted to express to others. And these views were highly partisan, highly opinionated, and represented the spectrum of political viewpoint at the time. And there were many newspapers in cities like New York, Philadelphia, all up and down the eastern seaboard. And so the colonial press established newspapers in this country as highly opinionated vehicles, and often newspaper editors and publishers were degrading or denigrating each other in their own papers back and forth. So think about colonial times in this country and take that on up to about the Industrial Revolution, and keep in mind that all during that time, newspapers were highly partisan, highly opinionated, full of bias. The penny press changed all that, and you'll read about the penny press. And with the transformation of the American population, with the beginning and movement of people from agrarian cultures into urban centers, with the Industrial Revolution, where there were jobs in cities, as the Industrial Revolution took off and manufacturing, the development of major goods took place, you had all these people moving into these urban centers. They wanted education for their kids, and they wanted to read something. And newspaper publishers, who at that point had been serving a very elitist and small population, saw an opportunity to make money. But they had to change the editorial content of their newspapers. They had to move their editorial opinions into a section of the newspaper that became known as the editorial section, right? And we still have that with us today. But the rest of their newspaper contained news that was written in a fashion to appear objective. Just the facts. Who, what, why, when, where, and sometimes how. And that's where we get that technique in terms of journalistic coverage. So, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, later 19th century, moving on into the 20th century, and on up to about the time when media conglomeration included the expansion of more and more diversified cable channels that were serving a smaller and smaller population. During that roughly 80 to 100 year span, you had in radio, in press, and ultimately in television news, this idea of a fair and objective reportorial style. There were editorials, even in television news. When I was growing up, the major networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, had segments later in their casts, often in the half-hour newscast, where somebody would talk for 3 or 4 minutes on particular issues of the day. But even that went by the wayside in times for reasons we won't really discuss here. So during this period of time, you had objectified reporting. And then beginning about 1980, on up now to, 25, 35 years later, we now have returned to essentially highly partisan news, particularly in television news, because ownership often reflects the viewpoints, and the owner's political biases often reflect the viewpoints of that channel. So So yes, a lot of today's news, particularly in cable network news like MSNBC and Fox News Network, and sometimes even CNN, and all the other lesser players in that ballgame, do reflect a broad spectrum or semi-broad spectrum of political viewpoints. And we tend to denigrate those for being so biased. And I think that's often built on the idea that somehow it wasn't always this way. And the fact is that if you consider the 250 years of journalistic history in this country, over 60% of the time, people were engaging content that was highly partisan, highly biased. You'll also read about yellow journalism, and this was a time when newspaper owners and operators, particularly the big owners and operators like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, were interested in dominating and beating each other in terms of acquiring larger and larger shares of newspaper audiences. And so they engaged in journalistic practices that were sensationalistic, often fictional fabrications of real events of the day. Adventure stories where they'd send reporters out into more remote parts of the world and have them report back in installments. Just crazy, crazy stuff. Again, moving away from anything that represented objective reporting. And again, in an effort to essentially maximize audience share, because of course they were selling advertising space to advertisers. And if they could guarantee a larger audience, then they were going to get that advertising money. Always follow the money. Talked about that before. We've discussed already in the print chapter way early on in the semester how newspapers are in decline physically. Circulation numbers for metropolitan daily newspapers are down. However, we also know that specialty newspapers, particularly those that are serving ethnic audiences, religious groups, so on and so forth, are thriving. They're doing quite well because the costs of putting together a newspaper, of building a newspaper electronically, can happen right here at this computer desktop operation. The old days required a lot more overhead, a lot more equipment, a lot more staff on the payroll in order to be able to do that. So there are declines in print, particularly in terms of major metropolitan dailies. But as you also know, those metropolitan dailies are trying to shift their content over to electronic means like websites. And most newspapers now have an electronic component, and chances are you check that newspaper from time to time. You may go back to your hometown newspaper periodically online just to see what's going on. Not all of these websites are making money for newspaper owners and operators. There are very few actually that do. Some of the major national daily newspapers, like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, tend to do pretty well. Los Angeles Times is doing pretty well as well. So revenues are beginning to establish themselves in terms of the electronic versions of newspapers, but not at the rate that necessarily pleases advertisers. So traditional newspapers are trying to convince advertisers to hang in there while they build an audience, particularly of younger audiences who are reading newspapers online. But that will take some time. And I think ultimately, I'm not as optimistic as your authors, and I think ultimately we'll see the demise and the continued demise of local news outlets, newspapers that are trying to make some kind of success and inroads online. When I was taught how to be a journalist, we were told and taught ways to write stories that had a beginning and end and were posted by an afternoon deadline so they could get into the afternoon, or posted later in the evening so they could get into the morning paper. Today's 24/7 world, today's internet sources of information require, in programs like ours, that you learn a multi-platform method of reporting and that you learn how to get your hands on information and start a story and post that online, but continue to develop and gather information about that story and add installments over time. And you can see this happen in stories. If you follow a breaking story online, you'll see how the reporter continues to add information as they come into that information. So your generation's learning to do news a little bit differently than mine did, in that you're having to pay more and more attention to that 24/7 news cycle. And ultimately, we end up with the money issue. And the last item here says that traditional ad revenues are in decline, and that is true for newspapers. And ad revenues are slowly building. And newspapers are also finding ways to, any of us who go to newspaper websites know what I'm talking about, You have to wade through all the clutter in order to be able to actually get to the real stories. So they're still experimenting with techniques and hoping some things stick, some things work. And so those are some considerations that I want you to keep in mind as you read this chapter, and note how history often informs us about what's going on today. History often corrects our thinking in terms of what we think happened in the past, but really didn't. And the world of work for you as a journalist is changing, and this chapter provides some insights in terms of how that is happening. So thanks for joining me on this chapter on journalism. I hope you enjoy this chapter as you move on into it. We'll get back to you next week when we begin Module 10. Thanks so much.